The crimson sun bled across the jagged peaks of Xylos, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced with the swirling dust devils. On the cracked, barren plains below, a lone figure knelt, her head bowed in the face of the alien king's displeasure. Her name was Lyra, though her master, Xarthas, rarely used it. He preferred Thrail, a guttural slur in the Xylosian tongue that translated roughly to worthless or less than. It was a brand, seared into her very being by years of servitude. Lyra wasn't Xylosian. She was human, a rarity on this harsh, unforgiving world, a relic of a forgotten interstellar trade route that had long since crumbled. She had been a child when she was taken, ripped from her family, her home, her earth. Now, she was little more than a shadow, a ghost haunting the edges of Xarthas's opulent palace, a palace built on the backs of slaves like her. Xarthas, the current ruler of the Xylosian Empire, was a creature of imposing stature. His chitinous exoskeleton shimmered like obsidian in the dying light, his multifaceted eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Lyra with disdain. He towered over her, his four-clawed hands twitching with barely suppressed rage. "You disappoint me, Thrail," he hissed, his voice a rasping growl that echoed across the plains. "Your offering is inadequate." He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist towards a small, withered plant clutched in Lyra's trembling hands. It was a rare bloom, a desert flower that only blossomed under the light of Xylos's twin moons. Lyra had risked life and limb to retrieve it, braving the scorching heat and the razor-sharp winds, all to please her master. But it wasn't enough. I tried, master, Lyra stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The storm. It destroyed most of the blooms. She knew it was a feeble excuse. Xarthas cared little for explanations, only for results. And her result was a withered flower, a symbol of her failure. "Silence!" Xarthas roared, his voice cracking like thunder. He took a step closer, his shadow engulfing her. Lyra flinched, bracing herself for the inevitable. A blow, a harsh word, another day of torment. It was her life, a monotonous cycle of servitude and suffering. She had long since given up hope of escape, of rescue, of ever seeing Earth again. Her only solace was the faint flicker of memory, the echo of her mother's voice, the image of a green field bathed in sunlight. These fragments of her past were all she had left, precious embers in the cold wasteland of her present. Xarthas's eyes narrowed. He could see the fear in Lyra's eyes, the resignation. It was a familiar sight, one that usually gave him a perverse satisfaction. But today, something was different. He felt a flicker of annoyance? No, it was more than that. It was a weariness, a sense of ennui. Lyra's fear no longer amused him. Her subservience no longer gratified him. It was all predictable. He had grown tired of her, tired of all his slaves. They were all the same, broken and obedient, their spirits crushed beneath his heel. He craved something different, something challenging. "You are worthless, Thrail," he repeated, his voice laced with a newfound coldness. "You serve no purpose. You are a blight on my palace, a reminder of my weakness." Lyra's breath hitched. She had heard those words before, but this time, they carried a different weight. She knew what was coming. Xarthas had grown tired of her. He was going to dispose of her. She had seen it happen to other slaves, those who had outlived their usefulness. They were taken to the Whispering Caves, a desolate place where the wind howled like a banshee, and left to die. Lyra closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She had learned long ago that it was futile. She simply waited for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, Xarthas turned away, his back to her. "Guards!" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the plains. Two hulking Xylosian warriors, clad in heavy armor, emerged from the shadows. They were creatures of immense strength, their bodies covered in thick plates, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. "Take her," Zarthus commanded, gesturing towards Lyra. "Take her to the lower dungeons." Lyra's eyes snapped open. The lower dungeons? That was worse than the Whispering Caves. The caves offered a swift death, a release from suffering. The lower dungeons, they were a place of nightmares, a labyrinth of torture and despair. Slaves were sent there not to die, but to be broken, to be stripped of their humanity, to become nothing more than mindless puppets. The guards seized Lyra, their rough hands gripping her arms. She struggled, but it was useless. They dragged her across the plains, towards the looming silhouette of the palace, its dark towers piercing the twilight sky. As she was pulled away, Lyra glanced back at Zarthus. He was standing there, his figure silhouetted against the crimson sun, his face obscured by shadow. She couldn't read his expression, but she sensed a shift in him, a change that she couldn't quite understand. It was as if he was no longer the same king she had known, the same cruel and capricious master. There was something else in his eyes, something unsettling. The lower dungeons were a world unto themselves, a subterranean maze of damp, echoing corridors and cramped, airless cells. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and despair, the silence broken only by the drip of water and the occasional groan of a prisoner. Lyra was thrown into a small, dark cell, the heavy door clanging shut behind her. She landed on the cold, stone floor, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She had no idea what awaited her in this place, but she knew it couldn't be good. She huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to find some semblance of warmth in the damp chill. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure up the memory of her home, the image of the green field, the sound of her mother's voice. But the darkness of the dungeon seemed to seep into her mind, extinguishing the embers of her past, leaving her with nothing but the cold, hard reality of her present. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Lyra lost track of time. The days and nights were indistinguishable in the perpetual darkness of the dungeon. She was subjected to all manner of torments, both physical and psychological. The guards delighted in her suffering, their cruelty seemingly limitless. They wanted to break her, to crush her spirit, to turn her into a mindless drone. They wanted to erase the last vestige of her humanity. But Lyra clung to her memories, to the fragments of her past. They were her lifeline, her only source of strength in the face of unimaginable suffering. She refused to let them take that away from her. She would not break. One day, a new guard came to her cell. He was different from the others. He didn't sneer at her. He didn't taunt her. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and something else. Something that Lyra couldn't quite decipher. He opened the cell door and gestured for her to come out. Lyra hesitated. She had learned to distrust any kindness, any semblance of compassion. It was always a prelude to more suffering. But she had no choice. She was too weak to resist. She slowly rose to her feet, her body aching, her legs trembling. She followed the guard out of the cell, into the maze of corridors. Where was he taking her? What awaited her this time? She had no answers, only the gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach. The guard led her through the labyrinthine corridors, deeper and deeper into the bowels of the palace. Finally, they reached a large, ornate door. The guard opened the door, revealing a brightly lit chamber. Lyra blinked, her eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden light. She stepped into the chamber, her gaze sweeping across the room. It was lavishly decorated, with tapestries hanging on the walls and intricate carvings adorning the ceiling. In the center of the room, a figure stood, his back to her. He was tall and imposing, his silhouette familiar. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. It was Zarthus. He turned to face her, and Lyra gasped. He was no longer the same king she had known. His chitinous exoskeleton seemed less menacing, his eyes less cold. His gaze, once filled with disdain, now held a strange intensity, a flicker of something that Lyra couldn't quite place. It wasn't the cold, calculating look of a tyrant. It was something more thoughtful. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she had been brought to his palace. His eyes lingered on her, taking in her emaciated form, her tattered clothes, the scars that crisscrossed her skin. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, something that surprised him. He saw a spark of defiance, a flicker of resilience that had somehow survived the horrors of the lower dungeons. "Thrail," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. It was still commanding, but the harsh edge was gone. Lyra didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her mind reeling. What was happening? Why had he brought her here? Why was he looking at her like that? She had spent so long in the darkness, both literal and metaphorical, that she could barely comprehend the light, the change in his demeanor. "You have endured much," he continued, taking a step closer. Lyra flinched, instinctively recoiling. Zarthus stopped, his eyes softening. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I will not hurt you." Lyra didn't believe him. She had heard those words before, whispered by guards before they unleashed their cruelty. But something in his voice, in his eyes, made her hesitate. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on him, wary and uncertain. "I have made a mistake," Zarthus said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have misjudged you." Lyra's eyebrows furrowed. Misjudged her? What did he mean? She was a slave, a worthless being in his eyes. What was there to misjudge? "I have seen your strength," he continued. "I have seen your resilience. You have survived what would have broken others. You are stronger than I thought." Lyra remained silent, her mind racing. Was this some kind of trick? Was he trying to manipulate her? She had learned to be suspicious of any kindness, any deviation from the norm. It was always a prelude to something worse. "I have been a fool," Zarthus said, his voice filled with regret. "I have treated you cruelly, unjustly. For that I apologize." Lyra's eyes widened in disbelief. Zarthus apologizing? It was unheard of. He was a king, a god in the eyes of his people. Kings didn't apologize. They commanded. They demanded. They punished. But Zarthus was apologizing. It was as if the world had turned upside down. "I know that words cannot undo what I have done," he continued. "But I hope that one day you can forgive me." Lyra still didn't respond. She was too stunned, too confused, to speak. She had spent so long being treated as less than human that she could barely comprehend this sudden shift in his attitude. "I have brought you here," Zarthus said, gesturing around the chamber, "because I want to offer you something. Something more than servitude." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. What was he offering? Freedom? It seemed impossible. After all she had endured, after all the pain and suffering, could he really be offering her freedom? "I want to offer you a choice," he said. "A choice that you never had before." Lyra's eyes narrowed. A choice? What kind of choice? She had no power, no influence. She was a slave. What choice could she possibly have? "You can remain here," Zarthus said, "in this palace. You can continue to serve me, as you have done in the past. Or you can leave." Lyra's breath hitched. Leave? He was giving her the option to leave. To leave the palace, to leave Xylos? It was what she had dreamed of for years, what she had prayed for every night. But now that it was actually being offered, she hesitated. She had been on Xylos for so long, she had been a slave for so long, that she barely remembered what it was like to be free. The thought of leaving, of venturing out into the unknown, was both terrifying and exhilarating. I understand that this is a difficult decision, Zarthus said. You have been through much. You need time to think. He turned away, his back to her once again. I will leave you now, he said. Take some time to consider my offer. When you have made your decision, come to me. I will be waiting. He walked towards the door, then paused, turning back to her. One more thing, he said. From now on, you will no longer be called Thrail. Your name is Lyra. And with that, he left the chamber, leaving Lyra alone, standing in the opulent room, her mind swirling with confusion and disbelief. Lyra stood there for a long time, her gaze fixed on the closed door. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Zarthus, the cruel and unforgiving king, had apologized to her, had offered her a choice, had even called her by her name. It was all so surreal, so unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had spent so long in the darkness, both literal and metaphorical, that she could barely comprehend the light, the possibility of freedom. She had been a slave for so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like to be a person, to have a name, to have a will of her own. Now, suddenly, she was being offered a choice, a chance to reclaim her life. But was it real? Or was it just another cruel trick, another way to torment her? She didn't know what to believe. She had learned to distrust any kindness, any deviation from the norm. It was always a prelude to something worse. She looked around the chamber, her gaze lingering on the tapestries, the carvings, the ornate furniture. It was a beautiful room, a symbol of the king's power and wealth. But to Lyra, it was also a prison, a gilded cage. She had spent so much time in the lower dungeons, in the darkness and the filth, that this opulence felt alien to her, almost suffocating. She longed for the simplicity of her cell, the familiar darkness, the silence that was only broken by the drip of water and the occasional groan of a prisoner. At least there, she knew what to expect. Here, in this beautiful chamber, she felt lost, disoriented. She walked towards the window, her gaze falling on the landscape outside. The crimson sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows across the jagged peaks of Xylos. The sky was a swirling canvas of purple and orange, a breathtaking sight. But Lyra didn't see the beauty. She saw the harshness, the unforgiving nature of this world. She saw the barren plains, the cracked earth, the razor-sharp winds. She saw the place where she had been a slave for so long, where she had suffered so much. She saw the place she might never escape. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure up the image of earth, the green fields, the blue skies, the sound of her mother's voice. But the memories were fading, becoming more and more distant. She had been on Xylos for so long that she was starting to forget what her home looked like, what her family sounded like. The darkness of the dungeon had seeped into her mind, extinguishing the embers of her past, leaving her with nothing but the cold, hard reality of her present. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the door. Zarthus had given her a choice. Stay or leave. It was a simple choice, but it felt like the most difficult decision she had ever had to make. She had dreamed of leaving Xylos, of returning to Earth, of seeing her family again. But now that she had the opportunity, she hesitated. She had been a slave for so long that she didn't know if she could survive on her own. She had no skills, no resources, no allies. She was a stranger in a strange land, a human on a planet ruled by aliens. Where would she go? How would she survive? She thought about Zarthus, his sudden change in demeanor, his apology, his offer. Was it genuine? Or was it just a game, a way to manipulate her? She had learned to distrust him, to fear him. But now, he was offering her freedom. It was a paradox, a contradiction. She didn't know what to believe. She didn't know what to do. She was trapped between her desire for freedom and her fear of the unknown. She was trapped between her hatred of Zarthus and her hope that he was telling the truth. She was trapped between her past and her future. She closed her eyes again, trying to clear her mind, to find some clarity in the chaos of her thoughts. She needed to make a decision, but she didn't know which way to turn. She was like a ship lost at sea, tossed about by the waves, with no compass, no stars to guide her. She was alone, utterly alone, in a world that was both familiar and alien. She was a human on Xylos, a slave in a palace, a woman on the edge of a precipice. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She needed to think, to analyze, to weigh the pros and cons. Staying in the palace meant safety, security, a roof over her head. But it also meant servitude, a life of dependence, a constant reminder of her past. Leaving the palace meant freedom, independence, a chance to start over. But it also meant danger, uncertainty, the possibility of getting lost, of being captured, of dying. She thought about Zarthus again, his words echoing in her mind. I have made a mistake. I have misjudged you. I have been a fool. I have treated you cruelly, unjustly. For that I apologize. Could she believe him? Could she trust him? He was a king, a powerful being, a creature who had enslaved her and countless others. He had shown her no mercy, no compassion. Why would he change now? Why would he suddenly offer her freedom? It didn't make sense. It was too good to be true. And yet, there was something in his voice, in his eyes, that made her hesitate. A flicker of sincerity, a hint of regret. Could it be possible that he was telling the truth? Could it be possible that he had truly changed? She thought about her past, her life on Earth, her family, her home. She remembered the green fields, the blue skies, the sound of her mother's voice. She remembered the day she was taken, the fear, the confusion, the pain. She remembered the long journey to Xylos, the harshness of the planet, the cruelty of her masters. She remembered the day she was brought to the palace, the vastness of the structure, the opulence, the power. She remembered the years of servitude, the endless tasks, the constant fear, the loss of hope. She remembered the lower dungeons, the darkness, the torture, the despair. She remembered the guards, their cruelty, their hatred, their desire to break her. She remembered the moments of kindness, the rare acts of compassion, the fleeting glimpses of humanity. She remembered the other slaves, their stories, their struggles, their resilience. She remembered the whispering caves, the desolate place where the wind howled like a banshee, where the unwanted were left to die. She remembered the fear, the terror, the knowledge that one day she too would be taken there. She thought about her name, Lyra. It was a small thing, a simple word, but it was hers. It was a part of her identity, a link to her past, a reminder of who she was. Zarthus had called her by her name, not Thrail, but Lyra. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It meant that he saw her, that he recognized her, that he acknowledged her humanity. It was a sign of respect, a glimmer of hope. She thought about the choice he had given her, stay or leave. It was a simple choice, but it was also a profound one. It was a choice that would determine the rest of her life. It was a choice between slavery and freedom, between despair and hope, between the past and the future. She thought about the future, the possibilities, the uncertainties. If she stayed, she would be safe, but she would also be a slave. She would be dependent on Zarthus, at his mercy, subject to his whims. She would never be free, never be truly independent. But if she left, she would be taking a risk. She would be venturing into the unknown, facing dangers she couldn't imagine. She would be alone, vulnerable, with no one to help her. But she would also be free. She would be able to make her own choices, to determine her own destiny. She would be able to live her life on her own terms. She thought about freedom, what it meant, what it felt like. She had been a slave for so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like to be free. She remembered the feeling of the wind on her face, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of laughter, the joy of being alive. She remembered the sense of belonging, the connection to her family, the love that bound them together. She remembered the feeling of hope, the belief that anything was possible. She closed her eyes, trying to recapture those feelings, to bring them back to life. She wanted to feel free again, to be free again. She wanted to be Lyra, not Thrail, not a slave, but a person, a woman, a human being. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the door. She had made her decision. She knew what she had to do. She walked towards the door, her steps firm, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for what lay ahead. She opened the door, stepping out of the chamber, into the corridor. She walked towards the throne room, where Zarthus was waiting. She had made her choice. She was ready to face her future. She was ready to be free. She was ready to be Lyra. As she approached the throne room, she could hear voices, hushed and urgent. She paused, listening. It sounded like a commotion, a disturbance. She could hear the clang of metal, the shouts of guards. Something was happening. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the throne room door, pushing it open. She stepped inside, her gaze sweeping across the room. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The throne room was in chaos. Guards were fighting, their weapons clashing, sparks flying. Silashan warriors were battling each other, their faces contorted with rage. In the center of the room, a figure stood, his back to her. It was Zarthus. He was surrounded by guards, their weapons pointed at him. He was fighting them off, his movements swift and deadly. He was like a whirlwind, a force of nature, cutting down his attackers with ruthless efficiency. Lyra watched in disbelief, her mind reeling. What was happening? Why were the guards attacking Zarthus? What had gone wrong? She had made her decision, she was ready to tell him, but now everything had changed. The palace was in turmoil, the king was under attack, and she was caught in the middle. She didn't know what to do, where to go, who to trust. She was trapped, once again, in a world of chaos and uncertainty. She was trapped between her desire for freedom and the reality of her situation. She was trapped between her past and her future. She was trapped between life and death. Lyra stood frozen, caught between the clash of steel and the roar of battle. She had come to declare her choice, to embrace the uncertain path to freedom, but the throne room had become a war zone. Zarthus, the king who had offered her a choice, was now fighting for his life against his own guards. She didn't understand what was happening. Had her decision, her mere existence, somehow triggered this uprising? Or was this something else entirely, a power struggle within the Xylashan court, a conflict that had been brewing beneath the surface of the seemingly peaceful palace? She had been so focused on her own dilemma, her own potential for freedom, that she had failed to see the larger forces at play. She had been a slave, a pawn in Zarthus's game, but now it seemed there was a much larger game being played, one that she didn't understand, one that she was caught in the middle of. Zarthus fought with a ferocity that belied his earlier weariness. He moved like a predator, his chitinous limbs a blur of motion, his claws tearing through the air, his eyes blazing with a cold fury. He was outnumbered, but he was stronger, faster, more skilled. He cut down his attackers one by one, his movements precise and deadly. He was a king fighting for his throne, a creature fighting for his survival. Lyra watched in a mixture of fear and fascination. She had seen Zarthus's cruelty, his ruthlessness, his power. But she had never seen him like this, in battle, unleashed, a force of nature. He was magnificent, terrifying, a true king. But even a king can be overwhelmed. The guards were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. They pressed their attack, their weapons flashing in the dim light of the throne room. Zarthus was beginning to tire, his movements slowing, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He was still fighting, but it was clear that he couldn't hold out much longer. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know why, but she felt a strange sense of loyalty towards Zarthus. He had been her master, her tormentor, but he had also offered her freedom. He had shown her a flicker of kindness, a hint of regret. And now, he was fighting for his life, surrounded by enemies, his reign hanging in the balance. Suddenly, a new figure entered the throne room. He was tall and imposing, clad in ornate armor, his face hidden behind a mask. He moved with an air of authority, his presence commanding attention. He raised his hand, and the fighting stopped. The guards turned to him, their weapons lowered, their eyes filled with respect. He was their leader, the one who had orchestrated this uprising. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Zarthus. "Your reign is over, Zarthus," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "The people have spoken. They will no longer tolerate your tyranny." Zarthus glared at him, his eyes filled with hatred. "You dare challenge me?" he roared, his voice hoarse. "You, a mere servant, a dog at my heels?" The masked figure chuckled. "I am no servant, Zarthus," he said. "I am the voice of the people. I am the one who will bring freedom to Xylos." Lyra's eyes widened in disbelief. This was a coup, a rebellion. The guards weren't just attacking Zarthus, they were overthrowing him. And this masked figure was their leader, the one who was taking his place. But who was he? What was his motive? What did he want? She had so many questions, but no one to answer them. She was a human in an alien world, a slave caught in the middle of a power struggle. She was a witness to history, a spectator in a play she didn't understand. The masked figure drew his weapon, a long, curved blade that shimmered in the light. He stepped towards Zarthus, his movements slow and deliberate. "It is time," he said. "Time for you to pay for your crimes." Zarthus snarled, his eyes blazing with defiance. He raised his claws, ready to fight to the death. But he was weakened, outnumbered, outmatched. He was a king without a kingdom, a ruler without power. He was a creature cornered, fighting for his life, but his fight was futile. The masked figure lunged, his blade flashing. Zarthus met his attack, their weapons clashing, sparks flying. The two figures fought, their movements a blur of motion. It was a battle between the old king and the new challenger, a fight for the throne, a fight for the future of Xylos. Lyra watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this fight would determine her fate, the fate of all the slaves, the fate of Xylos. She knew that whoever won, her life would change forever. She just didn't know how. The fight was brutal, a clash of titans. The masked figure was strong and skilled, but Zarthus was a seasoned warrior, a king who had fought countless battles. They fought with a ferocity that shook the throne room, their roars echoing through the palace. Lyra watched, mesmerized, her mind racing. She had to make a choice, a decision that would determine her future. Should she stay? Should she flee? Should she fight? She didn't know. She was torn between her desire for freedom and her fear of the unknown. She was trapped between her past and her future. Suddenly, Zarthus stumbled, his movements faltering. The masked figure seized the opportunity, his blade flashing. He struck, his blade piercing Zarthus's armor, his claws tearing through his flesh. Zarthus cried out in pain, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He fell to his knees, his body trembling, his lifeblood flowing onto the floor. The masked figure stood over him, his blade dripping with blood. He had won. He was the new king of Xylos. Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She couldn't believe what she had just seen. Xarthas, the cruel and unforgiving king, the man who had enslaved her, the man who had offered her freedom, was dead. He was gone, his reign over. The masked figure turned to the guards, his voice ringing out across the throne room. "The king is dead," he announced. "Long live the new king!" The guards cheered, their voices echoing through the palace. The rebellion was successful. The coup was complete. The masked figure had taken the throne. He turned to face Lyra, his gaze fixed on her. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't know what he wanted. She was a human, a slave, a witness to his victory. She was a loose end, a potential threat. She waited, her breath held, her eyes fixed on him, her mind racing. What would he do to her? Would he spare her life? Would he enslave her? Would he kill her? She didn't know. She was at his mercy, her fate hanging in the balance. He took a step towards her, his gaze unwavering. He reached out his hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Lyra flinched, bracing herself for the worst. But instead of pain, she felt a strange sense of recognition. His touch was gentle, almost familiar. And then, he spoke, his voice soft, almost kind. "Lyra," he said, "do not be afraid. I know who you are." Lyra's breath hitched. He knew who she was. How? She had been a slave, a nameless, faceless servant for years. How could this masked figure, this usurper king, possibly know her name, let alone her identity? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. Was this some kind of trick? A prelude to more suffering? She had learned to distrust any kindness, any deviation from the norm. It was always a prelude to something worse. But there was something in his voice, in his eyes, that made her hesitate. A flicker of familiarity? It was as if she had seen him before, somewhere, sometime. But where? She couldn't place it. Who are you?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The masked figure chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "That is for you to discover, Lyra," he said. "But first there is something I must show you." He gestured towards the throne room doors, which were now open, revealing a group of Xylosian guards standing at attention. "These guards," he said, "are no longer loyal to Xarthas. They are loyal to me. And they are here to protect you." Lyra's eyes widened in disbelief. Protect her? Why would they protect her? She was a human, a slave, a nobody. She had no power, no influence. She was nothing. "I know what you're thinking," the masked figure said, as if reading her mind. "You're wondering why I would protect you. You're wondering what I want from you. You're wondering who I am." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "The answer, Lyra, is simple. I want to give you back what Xarthas took from you. I want to give you back your freedom. I want to give you back your home." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. Her home? What did he mean? Was he talking about Earth? Was it possible? Could this masked figure, this mysterious king, actually help her return home? "I know that you are from Earth," he continued. "I know that you were taken from your family, from your home. I know that you have suffered much. And I know that you deserve better." Lyra's eyes welled up with tears. She hadn't heard those words in so long, words of kindness, words of compassion, words of hope. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a human being, to be recognized, to be valued. "I have been watching you, Lyra," he said. "I have seen your strength, your resilience, your courage. I have seen the spark of defiance in your eyes, the flicker of hope in your heart. and I know that you are destined for great things. He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was warm, comforting, familiar. And then, he removed his mask. Lyra gasped, her eyes widening in shock. She knew him. She recognized him. She had seen him before many times, in her dreams, in her memories, in the fragments of her past. He was her brother. "It's me, Lyra," he said, his voice filled with love and longing. "It's me, your brother Alex." Lyra's mind reeled. Her brother? He was alive. He was here. He was the masked figure, the one who had overthrown Zarthus, the one who was offering her freedom. It was impossible. It was unbelievable. It was a miracle. "Alex?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Is it really you?" He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that she remembered so well. "Yes, Lyra," he said. "It's me. I'm here. I've come to take you home." Tears streamed down Lyra's face. She couldn't speak, she couldn't move, she could barely breathe. She was overwhelmed with emotion, with joy, with disbelief. Her brother was alive. He had found her. He was here to rescue her. It was the moment she had dreamed of for years, the moment she had almost given up hope of ever experiencing. And now, it was finally happening. I don't understand," she stammered. How did you find me? How did you become king?" Alex took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "It's a long story, Lyra," he said. "But the short version is, I never gave up on you. I knew you were alive. I knew you were out there. And I spent years searching for you, searching for a way to bring you home." He explained how he had joined a resistance movement on Xylos, a group of slaves and free Xylosians who were opposed to Zarthus's tyranny. He had risen through the ranks, becoming their leader, their symbol of hope. He had planned the coup, orchestrated the rebellion, and overthrown Zarthus, all for one reason: to find his sister, to bring her home. "I knew that Zarthus had a human slave," he said. "I knew that you were here. And I knew that I had to find you, to rescue you, to bring you back to Earth." He paused, his gaze softening. "I'm so sorry, Lyra," he said. "I'm so sorry for what you've been through. I wish I could have found you sooner. I wish I could have protected you." Lyra shook her head, tears still flowing down her face. "It's okay, Alex," she said. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Alex smiled, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. He pulled her into a hug, a warm, comforting embrace that she had longed for so many years. She hugged him back, holding him tight, never wanting to let go. She had found her brother, her family, her home. She was no longer a slave. She was no longer alone. She was Lyra, a human being, a sister, a survivor. She was free. But as they stood there, embracing, a sudden tremor shook the throne room. The ground began to rumble, the walls to crack. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Screams echoed through the palace. Something was happening. Something was wrong. And then, a voice, cold and menacing, echoed through the darkness. "You thought you had won," the voice hissed. "You thought you had escaped. You were wrong." Lyra and Alex froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that voice. It was Zarthus. He was alive. The darkness was thick, suffocating. Lyra clung to Alex, her knuckles white, her breath catching in her throat. Zarthus? But he was dead. She had seen him fall, seen the masked figure her brother strike the killing blow. How could he be alive? The voice echoed again, closer this time, laced with a chilling amusement. You thought you could simply replace me? That you could waltz in here, take my throne, and live happily ever after? You forget, brother. I am not so easily defeated. Brother? Zarthus had called Alex brother. Lyra's mind reeled. What was happening? Was this some kind of nightmare? A flicker of light, then another, illuminated the throne room. Figures emerged from the shadows, Xylotian guards, but not the ones who had sided with Alex. These were Zarthus's loyalists, his personal guard, the ones who had escaped the initial uprising. They surrounded Alex and Lyra, their weapons raised, their eyes filled with malice. Seize them! Zarthus's voice boomed. The traitor and his pet. Pet? Lyra's blood ran cold. Zarthus still saw her as nothing more than a slave, even after everything that had happened. Alex pulled Lyra behind him, his stance defensive, his eyes scanning the room. Lyra, get out of here, he said, his voice urgent. Find a way out of the palace. No, Lyra protested. I'm not leaving you. You have to, he insisted. This isn't your fight. Get to safety. I'll find you. But Lyra refused to leave his side. She had spent too long being helpless, being a victim. She wouldn't run away again. She would fight. Zarthus emerged from the shadows, his figure silhouetted against the flickering lights. He was injured, his armor torn, his face scarred, but he was alive. And he was furious. You dare defy me, Alex? He snarled. After everything I've done for you? After everything I've taught you? Lyra's eyes widened. What was he talking about? What had Zarthus done for Alex? What had he taught him? You taught me how to be a killer, Alex replied, his voice cold and hard. You taught me how to be a tyrant. But you also taught me how to fight back. He lunged at Zarthus, his movements swift and deadly. The two figures clashed, their weapons flashing, their bodies a blur of motion. It was a battle between two brothers, a fight for the throne, a fight for survival. Lyra watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't just stand there and do nothing. She had to help Alex. She looked around for a weapon, anything that she could use. She spotted a discarded sword, lying near the fallen body of a guard. She grabbed it, her hand trembling, but her resolve firm. She ran towards the fight, her voice ringing out. Alex! I'm here! The fight was brutal, a clash of titans. Zarthus was stronger, more experienced, but Alex was fueled by rage, by a desire to protect his sister, by a need to avenge the years of suffering he had endured. He fought with a ferocity that surprised even Zarthus. Lyra joined the fight, her movements awkward at first, but her determination unwavering. She swung the sword, her aim true, striking at Zarthus's exposed flanks. You dare interfere, Thrail? Zarthus roared, his eyes blazing with fury. He turned his attention to Lyra, his claws outstretched. Lyra braced herself for the blow, but Alex intervened, stepping in front of her, taking the brunt of the attack. He cried out in pain, his body falling to the ground. Alex! Lyra screamed, rushing to his side. He was injured, bleeding, his eyes closed. No, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. No, no, no. Zarthus stood over them, his claws dripping with blood. You should have stayed out of this, Thrail, he said. Now you will both die. He raised his claws, ready to deliver the final blow. But then, something unexpected happened. The ground began to shake violently, the walls of the throne room to crumble. The lights flickered again, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the palace, growing louder and louder. It was the sound of something awakening. From the depths of the palace, from the ancient caverns beneath the city, a creature stirred. It was a creature of legend, a creature of myth, a creature that had been dormant for centuries. It was the guardian of Xylos, the protector of the planet, the one who would only awaken in times of great need. It was the Xylosian dragon. The dragon's roar shook the very foundations of the palace. The ground trembled, the walls cracked, the ceiling collapsed. The guards scattered, their weapons dropped, their faces filled with terror. Xarthas stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear. He knew what this meant. He knew that the dragon had awakened. And he knew that he was no match for its power. The dragon emerged from the darkness, its scales shimmering like obsidian, its eyes glowing like molten gold. It was a creature of immense size and power, its presence filling the throne room, its aura radiating fear and awe. It looked at Xarthas, its gaze piercing, its voice echoing through the palace. "You have disturbed my slumber," it said. "You have brought chaos to my world. You have abused your power. You have betrayed your people. You are no longer worthy to rule." Xarthas tried to speak, to defend himself, but the dragon cut him off. "Your reign is over," it said. "Your time has come." The dragon unleashed its power, a torrent of fire and energy that engulfed Xarthas, consuming him completely. His screams echoed through the palace, then were silenced. He was gone. The dragon turned its gaze to Alex and Lyra, who were still huddled on the ground, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. The dragon approached them, its movements slow and deliberate. It lowered its head, its eyes meeting theirs. "You are the ones who have brought balance back to Xylos," it said. "You are the ones who have shown courage and compassion. You are the ones who have earned my respect." The dragon then addressed Alex. "You are a warrior, a leader, a protector," it said. "You have fought for your people, for your sister, for what you believe in. You are worthy to rule." Alex looked at the dragon, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I do not seek power," he said. "I only seek peace. I want to help my people, to rebuild our world, to create a better future." The dragon nodded. "Then you shall rule with wisdom and justice," it said. "You shall lead your people to a new era of prosperity and peace." The dragon then turned to Lyra. "You are a survivor, a fighter, a symbol of hope," it said. "You have endured much, but you have never given up. You are an inspiration to us all." Lyra looked at the dragon, her eyes filled with tears. "I only want to go home," she said. "I want to return to Earth, to my family, to my world." The dragon nodded. "Then you shall return to your home," it said. "You shall carry the message of hope and resilience to your people. You shall be a bridge between two worlds." The dragon then spread its wings, its vast form filling the throne room. "I will take you both home," it said. "I will guide you on your journey. I will protect you from harm." Lyra and Alex looked at each other, their eyes filled with wonder and gratitude. They had faced death, they had witnessed miracles, they had found each other. And now they were going home. The dragon lowered its head, inviting them to climb onto its back. They did so, holding on tight as the dragon spread its wings and soared into the sky, breaking through the shattered roof of the throne room, leaving the chaos and the darkness behind. They flew above the city of Xylos, the lights of the palace twinkling below them. They flew above the barren plains, the cracked earth stretching out before them. They flew above the jagged mountains, the peaks piercing the sky. They flew above the crimson sun, the twin moons, the swirling clouds. They flew towards the stars, towards the unknown, towards their future. Their journey was long and arduous, but the dragon was a faithful guide, protecting them from the dangers of space, leading them through the vast expanse of the galaxy. They traveled for what seemed like an eternity, witnessing wonders,